Welcome to Break Free and Trust, a redesign for living. Join me, Chris.
And me, Jacqueline, for real conversations about life, death, and everything in between.
Learn to connect with your intrinsic power to grow and heal, how to laugh at your own humanness and not take life too seriously.
Through healthy conversations between the feminine and masculine, you learn how to harness the power of relationship and the mirror to befriend your shadow and to trust that any obstacle that gets in your way is there to help you grow.
Together, working at a practical level, you learn to trust that everything that is happening is for you, your growth, and ultimate freedom.
Our circumstances don't matter. It's only how we relate to them that does.
Get ready to befriend the wisdom of your body and the power of your mind.
Break Free and Trust starts now.
Welcome to Break Free and Trust, a redesign for living. I'm Chris.
And I'm Jacqueline. And on today's episode, we're going to discuss group work. Between Chris and I, we have a lot of experience on the participant and facilitator end of many different groups. We're both drawn to group work and the alchemy that can happen within the group container. And that said, we're also really conscious of some of the pitfalls of the group dynamic. Last week, just as I was contemplating another group offering, I came across an article called Not Another Group. And it actually really threw me for a loop. And so Chris and I sat together and discussed the article for a while. And we had a really interesting conversation. And we thought that it would be a beautiful opportunity to bring that dialogue to this space and talk about the power and pitfalls of group with all of you.
Okay, group work. So the topic of group work, it's huge, right? It covers group therapy, group spiritual practices, fellowship, self-help groups, and the list could go on. And I think our listeners, Jacqueline, are likely to have all sorts of different unique experience and thoughts as to what group work is and what the benefits are. As a starting point, why don't we just begin with what you and I are doing today and see how that develops? So, Jacqueline, maybe I'll ask you if you want to introduce the topic by sharing on how you're involved with group work today.
Mm-hmm. That's kind of an interesting question at this moment in time because so much of my work was actually group focused, especially over the last 3 or 4 years. And about 3 months ago, I really pulled back from group work to go really quiet and to spend some time with me. So right now, and there's a story there, which we can get to later, but right now I am in the process of resurfacing from that pause and beginning once again to hold different group spaces. I think that's probably where I'm going to leave that for now. And maybe we can come back to it a little bit later.
So.
Does that feel?
Yeah, I think there's a story to tell there.
Okay. So that's my piece. But on your side, as I've pulled back, you've kind of gone gung-ho forward. And your engagement in group at this point in time is really quite profound and prolific. Would you be willing to share where your engagement is right now?
Yeah, for sure. And it's like our yin and our yang. Eh? We're always moving these different directions, but from the same place. As Jacqueline said, I've really gone all in group work recently. I'll just start with the current situation. So I belong to a recovery fellowship, and I would say that's actually my personal life anchor. There's all sorts of meetings during the week, workshop, things like that. I'm a regular attender. I'm also involved in a spiritual reading group. And for example, we just finished reading Sermon on the Mount by Emmett Fox, and the group meets and discusses that. That's been fulfilling. I have a meditation and intention group, and we meet once a week to set an intention for the group members' meditation for that week. So we're all focusing our energy in the same intention. And more recently, I'd say since the start of the year, I've really got to my passion of group work by starting something with a friend of mine called Good Man Friends. And the objective here is to end the epidemic of loneliness in men, which itself is a whole topic. I'm not going to get into it in here. But really, this is where my passion and direction of energy has been really headed in the past 6, 7 months. So that's where I'm at with the group stuff now. But Jacqueline, I also know you have been involved in group work much longer than me, and you've shared with me many powerful experiences through involvement with groups along your journey. As a way to go deeper into the subject of group work, would you mind sharing some of bigger experiences with us now?
Sure. So I think I would preface that by saying that, from the time I was a little girl, there was this part of me that longed to belong. And so I wanted so badly from the time I was quite young to be a part of a group. And I always somehow found myself on the fringe.
So like no team sports or things like that?
I did. I played soccer and I played volleyball, but really my sport was tennis and I did not play doubles. I think I was a bit competitive.
Yeah. So as a side note, be careful of playing tennis with Jacqueline.
We have fun. But saying that, I think that there was a part of me that was always seeking group. And in my seeking of group, inherently, there was a mistrust of group, which I find kind of interesting looking back now. Mm-hmm. And, my first memory of group work was when I was doing my master's degree. And I was rebellious. I was in my early 20s. I was one of the youngest people in my program.
And what master's degree program?
Chinese medicine. Okay. And I was full of piss and vinegar and full of sort of like a rebellious type energy. And I didn't like to be told what to do or what to think. And so I kind of went tete-a-tete with the head of my school. And he would say something. It reminds me a little bit of my son. Like he'd say black and I'd say white. Mm-hmm. But it was really important for whatever reason in that stage of my development to challenge. And he challenged right back. And he challenged back publicly. And he challenged back in a way that was his intention, I think, was to break me down, to have me see where I was getting in my way. But his approach was brutal. And he literally cracked me open in front of a room of at least 30 or 40 students to the point that I was lying on the floor like a wounded deer.
Yeah, so clearly something you weren't ready for at the time.
I wasn't ready. It felt inappropriate. It wasn't the right set. Like altogether felt wrong. If you went to a retreat to face some of your stuff and this is what happened and that's what you signed up for, okay. But I was just a student in a class. Right. So to take me aside afterwards and have a conversation probably would have been wise. But at the time, he broke me like an animal. And he showed me what I needed to see, but I wasn't ready to see all of it in that way. And let's just say that I was so destabilized from the experience that my mom thought that I was a part of a cult and she needed to drive across the country to come pick me up and bring me home because what was happening wasn't okay. At the end of the day, I settled months later, and I made myself a promise. And the promise was that no matter what kind of work I ever did, that I would never put somebody in that position. And I think that experience left me with a taste of what happens when a leader within a group abuses power. And so I became very mistrustful of group settings.
But in the sense I hear you're talking about is that, and then you became, if I'm a leader, I would do it differently.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm trying to think about what other experiences I want to share. So that was a negative experience that led me down a path that kept me away from group, actually. And I'll fast forward many years. I was doing a Kundalini yoga teacher training, and at the same time, I was doing a counseling degree. Or I was finishing a counseling degree. And in both of those situations, I came in as a student. And towards the end of my training, was put in a position where I was asked to lead group. So in my teacher training, I was asked to take over for my teacher. And in my counseling training, I had gone to work for a recovery and trauma center. And I was doing one-on-one work with people. But I didn't realize that I was also going to be doing group work with people, and had very little training in group work, and was sort of thrown in. So in both of those situations, I was tossed in to facilitate and lead group, which was something that terrified me. And I had never had any intention of doing. When I took my teacher training, I took it for personal development. I hadn't taken it to teach. And when I look back, those are two of the most impactful moments in my life, not just as a professional, but as a human being. Because facilitating group, one, it became a passion, and it remains a passion. Two, it probably became the deepest personal development work I have ever done, which was not at all what I thought it was going to be. And three, it became the most sacred and beautiful energetic experience that I've ever had. Group has taught me so much. And I guess shall I share a little bit
Share a little
about
bit that too. And I just want to observe too that it's almost like you didn't know what to do as a facilitator, but you knew what you didn't want to do from that early experience. So you had a sense of who you didn't want to be in it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I had a sense of who I didn't want to be. What I didn't realize that was that in being asked to step in and lead group was that I would face my ego right away. And it wasn't facing the ego of, oh, look at me, I'm so wonderful. It was the ego of, I don't know anything. What am I doing? Who am I supposed to be? How am I supposed to do this? I can't compare. The people that came before me were so wonderful at their work. What am I?
Maybe I'm an imposter, maybe even.
Oh, 100%.
So you really had trial by fire.
100%. And I had this moment in my yogic teaching where I was on my way to go and teach. And on my way to teaching, I saw a man who was about to fall on the sidewalk. So I pulled my car over and I caught him on his way down, and he died in my arms. Ambulance came, etc. And I had to go and walk 10 minutes later in to teach a yoga class of about 30 students. And I was shaky. My whole nervous system was fried. So I got up there and I was, doing my thing to try and be tough and figure out how to ground myself and center myself. And there's a creed that we're taught as teachers. And I started to repeat it to myself over and over again. I had never used it before, but I was sort of grasping for something.
This was the time you're supposed to use that, right? Yeah.
And I was repeating it. And all of a sudden I sort of heard the fallacy in all of it, which was, I am not this, I am not this, I am not this, I'm a teacher. And in that moment, something in me shifted. And I shared with my class what I was experiencing. And I said, I'm a woman, I'm afraid. I am shaken. I am this. I am that. And in that speaking, it was like a door opened wide. And what happened was I invited every one of my students from that moment forward. And again, also every one of my group members in my therapy groups was, if we're going to be together, then I want all of you, which means bring your pain, bring your sadness, bring your anger, bring your rage. Let's create a space together and a container where all of what makes us messy humans can exist. And in that, my ego fell away. It was like the masks I thought I needed to wear to be the professional fell away. And what happened instead was my humanness was invited to show up, as was the humanness.
You modeled it for everybody else. And that mantra I heard you say, it's like this, I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm a teacher. I could reframe it. I'm not this, I'm not this. I'm going to pretend to be a teacher for the next half hour. And it's like, I'm not going to pretend. I'm going to be who I am.
Yeah. And it sort of felt like divine intervention in that moment, because it really did feel like a door just like flew open. And from that point in time forward, the way that I show up in group has really changed. And we can come back to that a little bit later. You have been incredible to watch over the last number of years in terms of watching you follow the threads of what really excites and engages you. The men's group that you spoke of, watching you engaged in that has really taken my breath away at different times. And seeing the commitment that you have to the groups that you're involved in has also really had a profound impact on me and what commitment really means. So I think it would be a really nice time if you would share with our listeners what your experiences, at least the most powerful ones in group, have been.
And then I'll appreciate the compliment from my first yoga teacher. But well, it's like the yin and the yang again. It's like our experiences of getting to this place are so different, yet the place we stand at right now is so similar. When I was younger, difference, I was involved with teams and clubs. I was in a fraternity at university. I was sort of all about the group and like exercise groups, things like that, but from a very social setting. Then I got older, got busy with family and kids and whatnot, and that sort of drifted away. One thing that never really entered my life from a group perspective or any perspective really was this sort of personal development work, which is really sort of the groups we're talking about right now. When those showed up, it came from a place of, being broken, having surrendered, and I certainly wasn't facilitating them. I was a desperate member of these groups because I needed them to help me on my journey. I didn't know how much I needed them. The very first one I stepped into was a group therapy at a treatment center, which you facilitated that. I have been a active participant in one. And what I want to share there is I
just want to interrupt you for a sec and just say, just so we're clear, I was not a facilitator at your center.
Yeah, different centers. Okay. The thing that jumped out at me, what was so different about this group therapy session, the first time I'd been in one, was compared to the one-on-one talk therapy I'd been doing up to that point. I suddenly walked into a room where there's a common bond. We shared something in common. We were suffering from something. I felt understood by almost everybody because they could relate to me. And I felt so little judgment no matter what I talked about. And that was one of the things that I'd really struggled with up to that point. I was feeling so much judgment, whether it was intentional or not, in my therapist sessions. And that would really come up whenever I started talking about challenges with substance abuse or alcohol and things like that. I would just feel so much shame and so much judgment in those sessions. I would just shut down. And what I came to realize is in this group setting, I could process and release the shame. There was nothing I couldn't talk about and not feel safe. And that was actually at that particular point in time, that was something I really needed, as well as holding space for other people to talk about their shame was also so therapeutic.
And so I just want to take a step back for a second and bring up some of Brené Brown's work around that, because what you're speaking is so important, which is that Brené Brown says, I think it's in one of her first talks, when you put shame in a petri dish and you put the cover on, what shame does is it multiplies exponentially because it's hidden, right?
Yeah.
But that when shame meets with me too, I also feel that. I've also experienced that. It dissolves. Shame is meant to be the guardian of our integrity, to show us when we've done something wrong and we've crossed ourselves. It's not meant to be something that we walk with day in and day out. And the beauty of a group like the one you're talking about is that it creates the opportunity for shame to dissolve so that work can actually begin.
Yeah, and for many people, processing that shame may just be the first step that's necessary 100%. And sufficient.
100%.
And that really brings me into the sort of the next group setting I walked into was that of recovery fellowships. I've been involved with many, and when I say recovery fellowships, it could be anything from, oh gosh, addiction to gambling, shopping, sex, drugs, alcohol. There's like 234 different recovery fellowships out there, and I'd say many of them have a very similar format to the ones I've experienced. And I still say these are mainstays of my life, and they're incredible groups that they were so far beyond what I expected when I walked into them. You know what? I'm trying to describe it in a way we can relate to. If you haven't been to one of these things, it's people who have overcome a common problem that now show up in service of other people that share that same problem, only to help them. That's it. That's the only thing they're getting out of it. And if I could sum it all up, I'm gonna step into the work of David Hawkins. If you're familiar with his work, David Hawkins recognizes that everything in the universe has a vibration or associated with it. This table here vibrates, sound vibrates, everything has a different vibrational frequency, including human emotions. And there's the lowest vibration on the spectrum of shame all the way up to the highest of joy. Some emotions are life enhancing and some emotions are life negating. And there's this crossover point that he identifies of where it becomes life affirming and life expanding, and that's courage. And if I'd sum it all up, I'd say these fellowships vibrate at the frequency of courage. And so you walk into one of these groups or rooms, and after an hour, even if you just sat there quietly in the back, like something shifted in you, and it's indescribable. And it's not that everybody in there is full of courage. They're not. It's almost like courage is the average of what this room looks like. And I'm going to paint a picture for you. There's a group of people that are in there that have just walked in, maybe their first time there. They're full of shame. They're in a river of shame. But what they get out of it is a place, as we talked about, to process that shame. All of a sudden they're speaking and nobody's judging them. Everybody's nodding. And then they hear other people tell these crazy stories that are just as wild as theirs. And that just creates this openness. And it leads to the next group, which is the group I'll call acceptance, where I think I'm going to be okay if I stop fighting this, because I look around me in this fellowship and there's some like shiny, happy people in here. This is not what I expected walking into, one of these meetings. And there's another level of people, another level of vibration I'll call willingness, which is a group of people that realize I can face myself and I can face my path because I have all these people here to support me. They're going to hold me through this thing. I don't have to worry about being judged. These people won't judge me. And then there's this frequency of unconditional love. And it comes from this place that I'm going to love and I'm going to redeem anybody that's been lost, because I've been lost myself and I know what it's like and I know what it takes. So I'm going to show up on unconditional love. And finally, there's part of it, just, I'll call it joy, because people have found a way to live their life in service of others. As I said before, just being exposed to this sort of group for even an hour changes us. When I first walked into these fellowship groups, I would go every day, sometimes multiple times a day, because I really needed it, and it just transformed me. Maybe I'll ask Jacqueline, what do you think? I've taken you to a couple.
Yeah. So before I met you, I was working in the field of addiction, and I still remember coming to that first meeting with you and crying through most of the meeting because of how deeply moved I was by the level of acceptance and grace that showed up in that space. I'll never forget a woman coming in who was brand new, and she was met with everybody clapping for her, welcoming her. And in that moment, this idea of like having the courage to even step foot in the room was probably so challenging to be met in that way it blew me out of the water, actually. And really, it really touched something in me that brought me back actually to my work in addiction when I was in Baltimore. And I was doing acupuncture detox with a group of addicts. And an older woman looked at a beautiful picture on the wall, and she had tears rolling down her face and said, when I look at that picture and see this beautiful woman, it makes me realize how ugly I feel inside. Mm. And she was in tears, and I was witnessing. And a young guy in the room who couldn't have been more than 18 got up from his seat, got down on his knees in front of her and said, I don't know what you see when you look in the mirror, but when I look at you, I see a queen. And he met her where she was. Mm-hmm. And it was the group that raised the vibration of the group. It wasn't any of us on the outside of the group that were doing anything. And having been there with you and watching that and then being reminded of this, I was actually quite enamored and moved and really conscious that all of my training in addiction felt like it didn't mean very much anymore when I watched a group of people who were meeting each other as they were, who belonged because of their experience, being able to be in service of each other. It changed me, actually.
Yeah, that's the experience most people have. They come in to that group not knowing what to expect, but they've not even come close to guessing what it's all about. It can be pretty profound.
It's been a joy to go back. I moved every time. It's not just like I moved once.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've in a couple more groups that were meaningful. Was a yoga group, and Jacqueline's already discussed that. I was in her class, but one I think is one more I want to touch on, but I think I'll take a quick break right here before I come back and talk about the last group.
Sounds good.
Okay. Okay, I think we're back. Yeah, I was just talking about group experience, and I think I wanted to highlight one more group experiences that I think is relatively important because it's probably the one I've had the most profound learning from a full experiential point of view. This is an anger management group that I was directed to go to. This is not one I chose to go to, and I didn't want to go.
I just want to comment on that for a second, because not only did you not want to go, but each week you didn't want to go. And what an amazing thing to be able to look back on it and recognize how impactful it was.
Totally. Yeah. And that was
because your resistance was strong.
100%. And it came about because in the depths of my addiction, I had an incident of violence. And I was directed to go to this group, and it was for like a year. And I thought, man, this isn't for me. Like, I'm not a violent or angry person outside of this, incident that is explained by this period of my life. I've never even been in a fight. This is the wrong thing. And I had all sorts of judgment. I assume I'm going to go there and everyone's going to be gang members and maybe this rough group. And, a big part of me thinks I thought I'm better than I think I'm superior. I don't belong there. Right. Boy, man, was I wrong, because, and this is the big learning experience with me. Every man there, the 10 men that were there in the first one, and basically a different 10 in the second one, they were just like me. They were all nice guys that had never committed an act of violence, weren't angry until they did. And this was such a powerful experience for me to witness and be part of this group and to sort of share the stories with these men. And what I discovered is that none of us had any idea we were holding these deep wounds and these traumas that were building up on us like a powder keg, just waiting to go off. And they did. And it wasn't until we started getting deeper into the sessions when we really started sharing our experiences with each other, because we trusted each other and talking about stuff in our life. It became, you could they became mirrors to me. I could see where that pain they had been holding was going to lead to something. They could see in me. But through that whole experience, I was really able to see those hidden or rejected parts of myself from my shadow. And what that it just set off a light bulb in me is like, people don't need to go to an anger management group after they've had an anger incident. They need to go before, because we're all capable of it and we need to understand how.
It's interesting, our paths are so parallel in terms of our experience, with you as a participant in group and me as a facilitator of group, because I also facilitated anger management groups way back when. And one of the things that became so clear for me in that co-facilitation was that all of this work was really about training our nervous systems and helping men in particular, but all of us really, to work with emotions rather than suppressing and repressing them, working with how to actually express them in a way that didn't lead to hyper arousal and then an incident like an attack. And it's kind of an amazing thing to have watched you go through the process again as a witness, or at least to receive you at home afterwards. Because one of the things that struck me more than any of the other pieces of work that you did was this awareness that you came into, or an acceptance that you came into, of every single one of us pushed to our edge has the capacity to be violent. And to know that we have that capacity gives us an opportunity to be able to draw ourselves back and do the work that we need to, so that it never gets there.
Yeah, I think it's perfectly said. Yeah, it's this almost like there's this capacity for malevolence that's in it, and if we're not aware of it and we pretend we don't have it, it actually can own us at some stage.
So I think this might actually be a really beautiful entry into your work with men, because it seems to me that from what I've observed, because I've had the opportunity to do a little bit of facilitation and a little bit of witnessing, and more from some of what you've shared, it feels like you're actually creating a space for men to be able to engage with each other and with their own emotions in a way that actually creates a beautiful forum for processing, so that these kind of events don't ever happen.
Yeah, and it's related to my participation in these groups. We're quite honestly related to watching your work with your groups and women's group. And one of the real observations I had is, one, men are very unlikely to talk about their feelings with other men, and that's not true with women. Men are very resistant to seeking help from a therapist, from a psychiatrist when something's bothering them. Men are so resistant to doing spiritual practices like yoga and meditation and things like that. They're almost always comprised of women. And what ends up happening is men tend to isolate themselves when they run into problems. I mean, it's exactly what I did, and they become addicted, or all this other stuff starts happening in isolation. And one of the examples I use all the time as I'm talking to guys about, hey, why come to a men's group, is I've watched all these separations happen. And, what ends up happening after when a couple gets separated is, and this is, I'm generalizing here, it's not very, but the wife has been talking to her friends for a year, 2 years about stuff she's struggling with, seeking help, seeking advice, seeking support. The man's not talking to his friends about anything. Everything's great. Everything's awesome. Things can't be better. And suddenly the couple's separated, and the man, all his friends are completely surprised. They have no idea what's the problem. And it looks completely like his fault. And he becomes isolated and disappears. And I saw that going over and over again. And the idea is, men have been societally conditioned not to talk about their feelings with other men, not to talk about their issues, not to bring things up. And it's creating this epidemic of loneliness. There's a real opportunity here to create forums for men to get together on a weekly basis and check in, share what's going on, maybe do a little bit of work together, and maybe get together for a retreat once or twice a year and just do this type of work that is predominantly the remit of women. So that's what I'm excited about.
Well, and you know what I find what I find really moving about it is what you ultimately bring back into our family. Yesterday, Chris and I were having a conversation about pain. I've been really struggling with pain in my body over the last little while. And he came to me saying that he had spoken to somebody about how he could help me be with pain. And I was a little bit taken aback. I was struck, actually. And what ended up happening was we had a conversation, and he said, well, I'm asking a lot of people about how I can show up for you. And again, I was kind of taken aback and felt a little bit exposed in some ways. And what came out of that conversation was, I really value the men around me and the thoughts that they have, and the idea of being able to bring things that I'm struggling with and ask for guidance and advice is only going to make me a better person, and it's going to make me a better husband. And so to see that sort of come to life in you is, it's big. And it did take me back. Like, it did make me sort of, I caught my breath, because women do that all the time. But it's so different to hear of a man trying to do that, at least in my experience, right? And so, yeah, kudos to you, because the beauty that you're creating with these men's groups is, it's profound.
Yeah. Well, anyone who's from the men's group that's listening, I say kudos to you guys, because we didn't know really what we're doing as we started it. But I would say the group's mission has evolved from ending loneliness in men to an additional thing. Every man that shows up there is there because they want to be a better husband, better father, and a better man in their community, and a better role model. That's the objective. So all the discussions we have are helping each other to do those things. It's pretty beautiful.
Yeah. It's no wonder it's a passion project for you now.
Right. Yeah. Well, I want to come back to where we started. Jacqueline, you mentioned you've been taking a bit of hiatus from some of your group work, but maybe starting to edge back into it. Why don't you take it from there?
Which part?
Why the shift? Why? So first of all, why the hiatus? And then let's start with why the hiatus, and maybe the follow-up is what's bringing you back now after the hiatus? What's happened in here?
You know, I think there's a lot of reasons for the hiatus. But looking back on it, I'll give you my answer in hindsight. Yes. Group. I'm not so sure that I really think that there's anything more beautiful than what happens in a group. For me, especially as I was writing and journaling, thinking about this podcast, I'm most deeply moved in a group setting where movement is included. And I say that because I get to watch what happens when we go inside. And with guidance and direction, we then turn inward and begin to do our own work. And there's something as a witness to that is really profound to watch, that the group the group itself becomes this container for some incredibly beautiful and powerful work that happens for each person on an individual basis.
So everyone's doing their inside work, but within a group setting.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'm going to sneeze. Sorry.
Bless you.
Thank you. And I think what started to happen for me in terms of this particular group that I was holding, and I was holding it for 3.5 years every day, was that I started to get to concerned that too much of what was happening was focused on what I was doing as the facilitator of the group, and not enough was happening on that deep individual level. And maybe that's actually a projection, because here's the truth at the end of the day.
The truth.
Well, I hear myself say that, and maybe that's true. But what's actually true is that leading this group fed something in me so profoundly for so long that I was so nourished by facilitating that I actually never imagined that I would end it. But all of a sudden, I was no longer nourished in the same way. All of a sudden, I started to feel like it was work instead of a work of heart. And what happened for me was I don't work if it's not a work of heart. I leave when things aren't a work of heart because it's out of alignment for me. What happened when I pulled back was that what I realized was that it was time for me to actually go and do some deep inner work, and that group itself had become a distraction from that. And what I came to there was that sometimes groups have a ceiling. Like, we're meant to constantly be evolving, right? And that group in particular, and I would say it's true for all groups that survive, is that they're alive. They're alive, and they're shifting, and they're changing, and they're evolving. And what they need at different times shifts and changes. And something about this group began to feel stagnant, and it wasn't evolving. And so the experience I had was, well, then it needs to dissolve.
Or you weren't evolving.
I wasn't evolving. Good point.
Right. I was no longer evolving as a teacher or facilitator within the group. Leading the group, yeah.
And in that, if that's not happening, the group ceiling becomes that much lower. And if I'm not evolving and growing, then I have no business leading. And so it was time for me to step away. And I did. And in stepping away, I actually got to go and do some really deep work. And I learned something in a different way than I ever had, which was group is an incredibly beautiful place to belong to. And maybe we're meant to always belong to certain groups or be a part of certain things. Group has shown itself to be powerful through history. But what happened for me was this awareness of what I really wanted to belong to was me. And the places that I wasn't belonging to me, it was time to be with. And that what I was really longing for was my connection to source. And so that shift for me gave me an opportunity to do that work. And in doing that work, my love of group came back to life. One, I had evolved and shifted, and so now I had something new to share. But also this idea came up for me, which was, how can I now leverage that learning to be able to hold groups in a different way, and hold group in a way where the focus is really not on the teacher, but rather on the container and the group itself. And how can leadership begin to arise within the group itself that doesn't necessarily need, how does the group become self-led on some level, right? And that's not something that I have an answer to yet. It's something I want to experience and sort of experiment with. But it reminds me a little bit of, the groups, the fellowships that you're speaking about, that you're a part of. There is no actual leader. Leadership rotates.
Right.
So you are all a part of what creates
your group consciousness.
Your group consciousness. And while that may be so in other groups, I think too often the teacher is held as, the guide or whatever it is that people want to aspire to. Inevitably, the teacher falls from grace because we were never meant to worship a person.
Well, spiritual ego potentially kicks in. It happens, and that takes the whole group down potentially.
100%. And how many leaders have we seen that happen to?
And a big part of what I watched you do, in my observation, is I think to an extent you may not see it this way or see it, that you felt the footsteps of spiritual ego showing up, and it was also time for you to move on and do something else that may be related.
I think I felt the attachments of my students to me and me to my students. And there was something about it that went from feeling right and good to somehow feeling, it's a strange thing to say, but the word that comes out is dirty. Mm-hmm. There was something out of alignment and it needed to shift.
Yeah. And then if the spiritual ego takes over, the mind will justify why that's okay. And you chose not to.
Yeah, it didn't.
Yeah. I want to jump in, like how you've described that process and relate to how, I see the world, and particularly this work in forms of consciousness. Like I see a lot of the way that when we start embarking on this work, what we're ultimately is we're looking to raise our consciousness, widen our conscious awareness, and we're taking these steps and joining these groups and following these practices and seeing these teachers because we have a goal, and that's to raise our conscious awareness, which is ineffable. You can't actually describe what it means, but I think we all can tap into. We sort of know what that feels like, right? And the groups themselves have a consciousness, and they have a range. And most groups is a narrow range that's capped by the teacher. And you find, this group's for me because it feels comfortable. It's close to the level of consciousness I'm at, but slightly above. So I'm feeling challenged in this. And while you're in this thing and you're having this experience of raising consciousness, it feels great, but something happens when, this is just like a routine now. Mm-hmm. I'm not getting anything out of this. And what hopefully happens is you just don't keep staying in it because it's comfortable. It's like, no, now it's time for me to leave this group. This is a step in my process. And I got to find a new group, a new teacher, even a new technique. Yeah. These all meet you at a level of consciousness that once you get there and move slightly past it, you're looking for the next step in the process. And that's, I think, the big part of like what happens with any group, unless what's embedded in it is a range of this conscious experience.
So I would agree with everything that you've said, but I also want to bring something else forward, which is that I'm not sure that we always enter groups because we want to expand our consciousness. I think sometimes, without even being aware of it, we enter groups because we don't want to take responsibility for ourselves. Mm-hmm. And we end up handing that over to the group and to a teacher, and we have somebody to follow and to listen to, so we don't actually need to take personal responsibility for our own growth.
100%. Yeah.
And that's a serious pitfall, right? Of groups themselves.
Yeah. Or we come into it with this idea, like this is the guru mentality. There's a guru in here. If I'm just in that person's presence, I'm going to benefit from this. There's a sort of an idol asphyxiation, if you will. I just need to be at the feet of the guru.
Yeah.
And not do my own work.
Yeah. And that brings me back, I guess, to that original story, which is this mistrust in the guru, the teacher, because ultimately, at the end of the day, the teacher we're seeking is the still quiet voice inside of us. And any teacher that turns your attention towards the teacher versus that still quiet voice inside of you is operating out of alignment. And that's a lot of what happens out there.
Do groups have to start there though? Do groups have to start with, I'm coming to see the teacher?
They might.
Yeah. It might be a part of the evolution.
Absolutely. But evolution, I think, is what's key, right?
Right. And even the hierarchy might be part of the evolution. You can just start with that, but it doesn't have to end that way. Like after a certain point in time, people like I can get into a group now that doesn't have a leader because there's an understanding with the people in it that will share the responsibility. We just don't need a leader. We know what to do.
Yeah. Yes. And I think that no matter what group you begin with, there still needs to be some piece of it that is empowering you to think for yourself, to feel for yourself, to trust in your own intuition. And if a group is not doing that, then you really need to question why you're there.
And how do you identify that? That's a really, really good point. How do you know when those criteria are in place?
I can't say how you would know that those criteria are in place. I can tell you for me, my body would scream no. I think if you go into a group and you feel small, if a teacher makes you feel less than, if you feel like you have to wear masks in order to fit in, then there's something operating that's out of alignment. If you feel shame in a room, you're out of integrity. And because we're all people and we're all messy and we're imperfect and we have our own work to do and growth to do, any leader that you come in contact with is just a person who's operating out of their own level of consciousness. And they haven't arrived. None of us have arrived. We're just all walking each other home.
We're all students.
Absolutely. Yeah. But because of that, we have to recognize the fallibility of teachers and stop holding them to a standard that they can't possibly meet.
Yeah.
And teachers
will always let you down if you do that.
1,000%. Yeah. And you know what? They won't let you down if you don't hold them to that standard, because you never expected them to be anything other than a person.
Right.
So, what would you like to leave our listeners with from this conversation?
That's a great question, because again, it's such a broad topic, but I think I'd say, like, just recognizing that group work, in addition to individual work, but separate from it, can provide really a range of powerful benefits to the members of the group. It's a safe place to process shame. We can use others to mirror ourselves and to see ourselves and others which we can't do on our own. And, one of the things for me, groups in particular, and this may be really specific to me, but the groups I tend to get engaged in, they provide me an opportunity to be in service of others. Mm-hmm. It provides an opportunity to, hey, I'm going to take what I've benefited from this. And there are going to be people that from day one, I can change their lives. I can help them. I can carry this message. And that's really where I relate to groups now. That's what keeps me coming to them. It's an opportunity to be in service. And it just seems like this boundless place once we're in service. There's no cap in terms of like what it brings to us personally. And saying I guess that's my takeaway. But also to just be mindful of some of the pitfalls of any group. Like I think you've outlined really well the idolizing of the teacher, the being stagnant, the feelings of shame, too much hierarchy. It's great to try lots of groups. When you recognize something doesn't feel right about this group, move on. There's lots of groups that will feel right to you.
Yeah.
How about you?
I could say so many things, but I think that what's sort of coming up for me in this moment is the idea of the butterfly, well, the caterpillar and the cocoon. And, sometimes the caterpillar goes into the cocoon, and the cocoon itself is the container of a community that holds you steady and that allows you to feel seen, to feel heard, to feel felt, to be loved. And that in that cocoon, you can grow in the way that you need to and then emerge as the butterfly. And sometimes the cocoon that you need to enter is independent of group and actually a cocoon of solitude. And that in that cocoon, engagement in terms of connection happens with the sacred and with self and with source. And that from that place, you then emerge as a butterfly. And that there's a time and a place for both. And if you find yourself constantly being drawn to group, you might want to experiment what it would be like to actually do some of that work on your own. And if you're used to doing work on your own, it might be a really interesting experience to see what group consciousness and a collective can do to help in that transformation. And only you know what's right for you in any given moment. And with that, I think we're complete for today. Yeah.
We're complete. That's a wrap. Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
You've been listening to me, Chris.
And me, Jacqueline, on Break Free and Trust, a redesign for living.
Tune in every second and fourth Monday at 3 p.m. on Transformation Talk Radio for more real conversations about life, death, and everything in between.
Learn to connect with your intrinsic power to grow and heal, how to laugh at your own humanness and not take life too seriously.
Through healthy conversations between the feminine and the masculine, you will learn how to harness the power of relationship and the mirror to befriend your shadow, and to trust that any obstacle that gets in your way is there to help you grow.
For more information or to connect with us personally, visit theway-healing.com. That's theway-healing.com.